Some people say I'm defying culture, but we are defining it.
In a small African district, thousands of young girls were being forced into marriage before they even turned 18. For generations, nobody challenged the tradition, until one woman became chief. And with a single decision, she began canceling marriages one by one, eventually ending more than 3,500 child marriages. Welcome to Untold Reality Daily, the channel where we uncover powerful real-life stories, hidden histories, and remarkable individuals whose actions changed lives in ways most people never hear about. From forgotten heroes to unbelievable true events, we bring you stories that reveal the deeper side of our world. Today's story takes us to a rural district in Malawi, where one traditional chief made a decision that would transform the future of thousands of young girls. Let's begin. The chief who declared war on child marriage. This story takes us to Malawi, a small country in southeastern Africa. In the rural district of Dedza, traditions have shaped community life for generations. In many villages, early marriage was once considered normal. Girls as young as 13 or 14 were often married off to older men. For many families, poverty made these marriages seem like the only option. But one woman decided that tradition would no longer be an excuse. Her name was Senior Chief Theresa Kachindamoto. She was not just an ordinary woman. She was a traditional leader, a powerful chief responsible for overseeing more than 900,000 people across hundreds of villages in Dedza District. When she became chief in the early 2000s, many people expected her to simply preserve the customs that had existed for generations. But Theresa Kachindamoto had something else in mind, because she had seen what those traditions were doing to young girls. Girls leaving school. Girls forced into marriages they did not choose. Girls becoming mothers before they were even adults. To her, this was not culture. It was injustice. And once she became chief, she made a bold decision. She would fight to end child marriage in her region, no matter how powerful the tradition was, and no matter how many people opposed her. What happened next would shock the entire country, because Chief Theresa Kachindamoto would go on to annul more than 3,500 child marriages, returning thousands of young girls back to school and transforming the future of an entire generation. But her journey to become one of Africa's most respected leaders did not begin in a palace. It began with a young girl growing up in a traditional Malawian family, long before she ever imagined becoming a chief. Great idea. A documentary-style upgrade will make the story more authentic, emotional, and powerful, which is exactly what performs well on storytelling channels like Untold Reality Daily. We will rebuild the script so it is historically accurate and cinematic, including her name, her title, Senior Chief, her country and district, her background, how she became chief, how she annulled 3,500 child marriages, the impact on girls' education, her legacy. We will still follow your rule, one chapter at a time for approval. Hook. In one small African district, thousands of girls were forced into marriage before they even turned 18. It had been happening for generations. Families believed it was tradition. Communities believed it was normal. But one woman decided it had to stop. And with the power of her authority, she would go on to cancel more than 3,500 marriages, saving thousands of girls from a future they never chose. Channel intro, welcome to Untold Reality Daily, where we uncover powerful real-life stories, hidden histories, and remarkable individuals who changed the world in ways most people never hear about. Today's story is about a traditional African leader who stood against centuries of tradition and transformed the lives of thousands of young girls. The land where tradition ruled. Our story begins in Malawi, a landlocked country in southeastern Africa. Known as the warm heart of Africa, Malawi is famous for its welcoming people, beautiful landscapes, and deep cultural traditions. But like many parts of the world, some traditions carried painful consequences. In the rural district of Dedza, life moved at a slower pace. Villages were surrounded by farmland. Families depended on agriculture to survive. And communities were deeply guided by traditional leadership. In these villages, chiefs held enormous influence. They settled disputes, protected local customs, and served as the voice of the people. For generations, one practice remained common across many communities: child marriage. Young girls, sometimes only 13, 14, or 15 years old, were often married off. Sometimes it was because of poverty. Families struggling to survive believed marriage would give their daughters financial security. Sometimes it was because of pregnancy. In many villages, a girl who became pregnant outside marriage was quickly forced into a wedding, and sometimes it was simply tradition, a belief passed down for generations. But the consequences were devastating. Many girls dropped out of school permanently. Their dreams of education disappeared. They became mothers while still children themselves. And their futures became limited to survival. For many years, these marriages continued without serious opposition, until a woman named Theresa Kachindamoto stepped into a role that would change everything. She was not born into power. She was not raised expecting to rule villages. In fact, her path toward leadership began a completely different world, before she became one of Malawi's most respected chiefs. Theresa Kachindamoto lived a life that looked very different from the traditional leaders around her, and the experiences of her early life would eventually shape a mission that would shock the entire nation. The woman who never expected to become chief. Long before she became known across Malawi as a fearless defender of young girls, Theresa Kachindamoto lived a very ordinary life. She was born in 1958 in the Dedza District of Malawi. Her family belonged to the Chiwa ethnic group, one of the largest cultural groups in the region. Like many children growing up in rural Malawi during the 1960s and 1970s, her childhood was shaped by community traditions, village life, and strong cultural values. In her community, the role of traditional chiefs was deeply respected. Chiefs were more than symbolic leaders. They were guardians of culture. They settled disputes, oversaw land matters, and represented the interests of their people. But despite growing up within this traditional system, Theresa did not expect that one day she would lead it. Her path in life initially moved in a completely different direction. As a young woman, she pursued education and later found employment in the Malawian government service. She worked as a secretary in the Ministry of Education, living and working far from the rural villages of Dedza. For years, her life followed a quiet and stable routine: office work, family life, city living. She had no reason to imagine that her future would one day involve ruling hundreds of villages. But destiny sometimes arrives unexpectedly. In the early 2000s, something happened in her home district that would change her life forever. The position of Senior Chief Kachindamoto became vacant. Traditionally, the leadership role passed through the matrilineal line of the family, and according to custom, Theresa was next in line. At first she was surprised, even hesitant. Becoming a chief meant leaving her government career and returning to rural leadership. It meant carrying responsibility for more than 900,000 people across hundreds of villages in Dedza. But after careful consideration, she accepted the role. In 2003, Theresa Kachindamoto was officially installed as Senior Chief Kachindamoto. From that moment forward, her life would never be the same. As she returned to Dedza and began observing the communities under her leadership, she quickly noticed something troubling. A pattern that had quietly existed for generations. Young girls disappearing from schools, teenagers becoming wives, children becoming mothers. The deeper she looked, the more disturbing the reality became. Many of these girls were not choosing marriage. They were being forced into it. And as the new senior chief, Theresa Kachindamoto, realized something powerful. She had the authority to challenge the very traditions that allowed it to happen. But standing against long-standing customs is never easy, because traditions are often protected by those who believe they must never change. And when she announced what she intended to do, many people in her community were shocked. Some were angry. Others believed she was threatening their way of life. But Senior Chief Theresa Kachindamoto had already made up her mind. She was going to fight child marriage, no matter how difficult the battle became. The day she declared war on child marriage. When Senior Chief Theresa Kachindamoto officially began her leadership in Dedza District in the early 2000s, she quickly realized that one problem stood above many others. Girls were disappearing from schools. Classrooms that once held dozens of students suddenly had empty seats. Teachers began explaining why. Many of the girls had been married. Some were only 14, some even younger. Others had become pregnant and were quickly forced into marriages with the fathers of their unborn children. In many communities, this was considered normal. It had been happening for generations. Parents believed marriage would secure their daughter's future. Village elders saw it as tradition, and many men in the community saw nothing wrong with marrying young girls. But Chief Kachindamoto saw something completely different. She saw lost futures. Girls whose education ended before it truly began. Girls who were forced to carry adult responsibilities while still children themselves. And girls whose dreams were quietly erased. The more she investigated the situation, the more serious it appeared. Child marriage was not just happening occasionally. It was happening everywhere. Village after village, family after family. And for many years, no one had seriously challenged the practice. But Chief Kachindamoto had something most people did not expect: authority. As a senior chief, she had power over hundreds of local village chiefs under her leadership. Those chiefs were responsible for enforcing local rules and protecting the well-being of their communities. And she decided that those rules were about to change. One day she called a large meeting. Village chiefs from across Dedza gathered to hear their new leader speak. Many expected her to discuss agriculture, land issues, or community development. Instead, she made a bold announcement. From that moment forward, child marriage would not be tolerated in her territory. Any marriage involving a girl under 18 would be immediately canceled, and any village chief who allowed child marriage to continue would face serious consequences. Some of the chiefs sitting in the meeting were shocked. Others were uncomfortable. Because this was not a small change. This was a direct challenge to a long-standing cultural practice. But Chief Kachindamoto did not hesitate. She made it clear that protecting young girls was now a priority. And she backed her words with action. Soon after the announcement, she began traveling across villages. When she discovered a child marriage, she would summon the families involved. She would bring the husband, the parents, and the village leaders together. Then she would deliver a simple ruling. The marriage was annulled. The girl would return to school. At first, many families resisted. Some argued that tradition allowed these marriages. Others feared losing financial support. But Chief Kachindamoto remained firm. In some cases, she even removed village chiefs who refused to enforce the new rules. Over time, something extraordinary began happening. More and more girls were leaving forced marriages, and they were returning to classrooms. The movement had begun, but the scale of the problem was far greater than anyone expected. Because across the villages of Dedza, thousands of young girls had already been married. And if Chief Kachindamoto truly wanted to change the future, she would have to cancel those marriages one by one, a task that many people believed was impossible. Yet over the coming years, she would prove them wrong. The chief who started canceling marriages. After making her declaration, Senior Chief Theresa Kachindamoto did not wait for change to happen on its own. She began acting immediately. Instead of staying in her office, she traveled from village to village across the Dedza District. Her mission was simple: find child marriages and send the girls back to school. End them. But the task before her was enormous. Dedza District contained hundreds of villages scattered across farmland and rural settlements. Many of these communities were far apart. Some were accessible only by dirt roads. Others required long journeys on foot. Yet Chief Kachindamoto remained determined. She visited schools. She spoke with teachers. She asked village leaders for reports about young girls who had disappeared from classrooms. Often those reports led her directly to households where child marriages had taken place. When she arrived, she would call the families together, the parents, the husband, the village elders, and sometimes the entire community. Then she would announce her decision. The marriage was over. Some men protested. They argued that the marriage was legitimate. Some parents worried about losing the financial support they believed the marriage provided. But Chief Kachindamoto stood firm. She reminded them that a child deserved education, not marriage, and she made something else very clear. Any village chief who allowed child marriage to continue could lose his position. This warning carried serious weight. Traditional chiefs depended on their authority and respect within the community, and losing that authority would be a public humiliation. Within a short time, several village chiefs who ignored her orders were removed from their roles. That action sent a powerful message across Dedza. The new rules were real, and they would be enforced. As months turned into years, the results became extraordinary. More and more girls were released from forced marriages. Some had been married for only a few weeks. Others had already spent years living as wives. Many of them believed they would never return to school again. But Chief Kachindamoto insisted on a second chance. She worked closely with teachers and local organizations to ensure the girls could re-enroll in school. At first, some girls felt ashamed returning to classrooms. They feared being judged by classmates. But slowly, confidence began to return. Uniforms replaced wedding clothes. Books replaced household chores. Dreams that had once been taken away began to return. And the number of annulled marriages continued to grow. 100, then 500, then 1,000. Over the years, the total would rise to more than 3,500 marriages canceled, each one representing a girl whose life had been redirected. The story of Chief Kachindamoto's actions began spreading beyond Dedza, first across Malawi, then across Africa, eventually across the world. But not everyone supported what she was doing, because changing tradition often creates powerful opposition. And some people believed she was interfering with customs that had existed for generations. Soon her mission would face its greatest challenge yet, the backlash against the chief. As the number of annulled marriages continued to rise, the actions of Senior Chief Theresa Kachindamoto began drawing serious attention across Malawi. At first, many people admired her courage. Parents whose daughters had returned to school thanked her. Teachers praised her efforts. Human rights organizations began recognizing her work. But within some communities, a different reaction began to grow: anger. For generations, child marriage had been accepted as part of cultural tradition. Many families believed they were doing the right thing. In poor rural communities, marrying off a daughter was sometimes seen as a way to reduce financial pressure on the family. Others believed marriage protected girls from social shame if they became pregnant. And some men simply did not want those traditions to change. So when Chief Kachindamoto began canceling marriages, some people felt she was interfering with their way of life. Rumors began spreading. Some critics claimed she was destroying culture. Others accused her of bringing foreign ideas into their communities. There were even whispers that she was embarrassing local families by forcing their private decisions into public attention. But the strongest resistance came from a group that had the most to lose: men who had married young girls. Some of them were much older than their wives. When the marriages were annulled, they lost the authority and control they had gained through those relationships. A few of them openly challenged the chief's decisions. They argued that once a marriage had been performed, it should never be undone. But Chief Kachindamoto refused to back down. In public meetings, she spoke firmly. She reminded communities that tradition should never be used to harm children. And she made something else very clear. The future of Malawi depended on educated girls who could become teachers, nurses, leaders, and professionals, not children forced into early marriages. She also enforced her policies strictly among the traditional leadership system. Village chiefs who ignored her orders faced serious consequences. Some were publicly removed from their positions. By the time the movement gained momentum, more than 50 village chiefs had lost their titles for allowing child marriages to continue. That decision shocked many communities. But it also sent a powerful message. Chief Kachindamoto was serious, and the rules were not optional. Slowly, something remarkable began happening. Communities that once resisted began changing. Parents started thinking differently about their daughters' futures. Village chiefs began actively reporting child marriages instead of protecting them. Schools began seeing more girls return to classrooms. What had started as one woman's decision was turning into a movement, and the world was beginning to notice. Because soon, international organizations and global leaders would begin talking about the chief from Malawi who was canceling thousands of child marriages. Her fight, which began in rural villages, was about to reach a global stage. The chief the world began to notice. What started as a local mission in the villages of Dedza District was no longer a quiet story. As the number of annulled child marriages continued to rise, people outside Malawi began hearing about the remarkable work of Senior Chief Theresa Kachindamoto. Journalists started visiting the region. They wanted to see the woman who had taken on a tradition that had existed for generations. Many expected to find a political activist or a government official. Instead, they met a traditional African chief dressed in cultural attire, speaking calmly but firmly about the future of young girls. Her message was simple. A child belongs in school, not in marriage. That message began spreading quickly. Soon, international newspapers and television networks began reporting on her work. Organizations that focused on human rights, education, and women's empowerment took notice. They saw something powerful happening in Dedza. a traditional leader using her authority to protect children. Many global organizations had spent years trying to reduce child marriage across different parts of the world. But here was a chief who was already doing it within her own communities. Her story became an example of how local leadership could create real change. Representatives from international organizations began visiting Dedza. They met with Chief Kachindamoto. They spoke with teachers. And most importantly, they spoke with the girls whose marriages had been annulled. Some of those girls shared emotional stories. They spoke about leaving school after being forced into marriage. They spoke about the fear they felt. And they spoke about the moment their marriages were canceled and they were allowed to return to their classrooms. Many of them said something similar. Without the chief's intervention, their education would have ended forever. Hearing those stories made the impact of her work impossible to ignore. Soon, Chief Kachindamoto began receiving invitations to speak at international conferences. Leaders from different countries wanted to understand how she had been able to challenge such a powerful tradition. During these events, she always emphasized the same idea. Change must begin within the community. She explained that traditional leaders have influence that governments sometimes struggle to reach. When chiefs speak, villages listen. And she had used that influence to protect children. Her work earned her global recognition. Human rights groups praised her courage. Education organizations highlighted the thousands of girls who had returned to school. And the name Theresa Kachindamoto became known far beyond the borders of Malawi. But despite the attention and praise, she never forgot the real reason behind her mission: the girls. Because even with thousands of marriages already canceled, the fight was not over. Across many communities in Africa and other parts of the world, child marriage still existed. And Chief Kachindamoto believed that if one community could change, others could too. But the most powerful part of her story was not the recognition she received. It was the lives that had been transformed. Girls who once believed their future had already been decided, were now building entirely new paths. And some of those girls would grow up to achieve things no one in their villages had ever imagined. The girls who got their futures back. Behind every one of the 3,500 marriages that were canceled, there was a story. A young girl whose life had been redirected. A future that had almost been lost. Across the villages of Dedza District, classrooms slowly began filling with students who had once disappeared. Girls who had left school after being forced into marriage were now returning. Many of them arrived carrying more than just books. They carried difficult memories. Some had already experienced motherhood. Others had endured emotional hardship far beyond their years. Returning to school was not always easy. Some girls felt embarrassed. They worried about how their classmates would see them, but teachers and community leaders worked together to support them. Chief Theresa Kachindamoto made it clear that these girls deserved a second chance. And slowly something beautiful began to happen. Confidence returned. Girls who had once believed their dreams were over began imagining new futures. Some wanted to become teachers. Others dreamed of becoming nurses, doctors, or business owners. For many families, seeing their daughters back in school changed the way they thought about marriage. Parents began realizing that education could offer opportunities that early marriage never could. Communities that once saw child marriage as normal began shifting their attitudes. Village leaders started encouraging families to keep their daughters in school. Schools began reporting higher numbers of female students, and the ripple effect spread far beyond Dedza. Other districts in Malawi started discussing similar reforms. Leaders from neighboring regions visited Dedza to learn how Chief Kachindamoto had achieved such dramatic change. They saw villages where girls were studying instead of marrying. They saw classrooms full of hope. And they saw proof that tradition could evolve without destroying culture. For many of the girls whose marriages were annulled, the future looked completely different from what it once seemed. Instead of early motherhood and limited opportunities, they now had something powerful: choice. And that choice was changing the destiny of an entire generation. But even with all the success and recognition, Chief Kachindamoto knew something important. The fight against child marriage was not finished, because while thousands of girls in Dedza had been protected, millions of girls around the world still faced the same threat. And the story of one chief in Malawi was about to inspire a much larger global conversation. The movement that inspired the world. By the late 2010s, the story of Senior Chief Theresa Kachindamoto had spread far beyond the villages of Dedza. What began as a local fight against child marriage had turned into a global example of leadership. International organizations began pointing to Dedza as proof that change was possible. They showed how a traditional leader had used her authority to protect thousands of girls. Governments from different parts of Africa started discussing stronger laws against child marriage. Advocacy groups used her story to encourage other communities to rethink harmful traditions. Because the truth was clear. Child marriage was not only a problem in Malawi. Across many parts of the world, millions of girls still faced the same reality. Some were forced into marriage before finishing school. Others lost their education entirely. And many were trapped in cycles of poverty that lasted for generations. But Chief Kachindamoto's work showed something powerful. Change could begin inside communities themselves. It did not always require international pressure or government intervention. Sometimes it required courageous leadership at the local level. Traditional chiefs, village leaders, teachers, and parents could all play a role. During interviews and public speeches, Chief Kachindamoto often explained her philosophy in simple terms. She believed that educating girls was one of the most powerful ways to transform a society. When a girl receives an education, she gains knowledge, confidence, and opportunity. And when girls succeed, entire communities benefit. Her words inspired many people. Young activists across Africa began referencing her work. Community leaders from different countries visited Malawi to learn from her approach. They wanted to understand how she had managed to challenge a tradition that had existed for generations. And the answer was surprisingly simple. She combined authority with compassion. She enforced rules strictly. But she also spoke directly with families. She explained the long-term benefits of education. And she reminded parents that their daughters deserved the same opportunities as their sons. Over time, her story became more than just a local success. It became a symbol, a reminder that traditions can evolve when leaders are willing to stand for the well-being of their people. But as the years passed, another chapter of her life was approaching, one that would reflect on everything she had accomplished, and the lasting legacy she would leave behind, the legacy of a fearless chief. As the years passed, the impact of Senior Chief Theresa Kachindamoto's work became impossible to ignore. Across the Dedza District, thousands of girls were still attending school because of the decisions she had made. Classrooms that once lost female students to early marriage were now filled with young girls determined to build brighter futures. Teachers noticed the difference. Village leaders noticed it too. Even families who once supported child marriage began to change their beliefs. Many parents started encouraging their daughters to finish school before even thinking about marriage. What had once been considered normal was now being questioned, and that change was one of the greatest achievements of Chief Kachindamoto's leadership. Her work also brought her recognition across Malawi and beyond. Human rights organizations praised her courage. Education groups highlighted her success in protecting girls' futures. International conferences invited her to speak about her experience. But despite the growing recognition, she remained deeply connected to the communities she served. She continued traveling across villages. She continued speaking with families. And she continued reminding people that the future of their children depended on education. For her, the mission had never been about fame or recognition. It had always been about the girls whose dreams had once been taken away, the girls who now had the chance to write their own stories. Many of those girls grew into confident young women. Some became teachers. Others entered professional careers, and many returned to their communities, determined to help the next generation succeed. Chief Kachindamoto often said something simple but powerful during interviews. When you educate a girl, you educate a nation. Those words reflected the belief that had guided her entire mission. Education was not just about individual success. It was about building stronger families, stronger communities, and a stronger future. By the time her story had reached the world, more than 3,500 child marriages had been annulled under her leadership. Each annulled marriage represented a girl whose life had changed, a girl who had been given another chance. And those thousands of second chances became the foundation of her legacy. But perhaps the most important part of her story was not the number of marriages she canceled. It was the example she set. She showed that leadership is not just about preserving tradition. Sometimes leadership means having the courage to challenge tradition when it harms the people you serve. And that lesson would continue inspiring people long after her story was told. The story of Senior Chief Theresa Kachindamoto reminds us that real change often begins with one person willing to stand up for what is right. In the villages of Dedza, thousands of girls were given a second chance at life, a chance to learn, a chance to dream, and a chance to build a future that once seemed impossible. And all of it began with one chief who believed that children belong in school, not in marriage. If you enjoy powerful, real-life stories like this, make sure you subscribe to Untold Reality Daily, where we bring you remarkable stories from around the world. Thank you for watching.